This is exciting. I've been contemplating this one for a little bit. So welcome to today's edition of the Mantra Corner. Today we're going to be discussing a very, very deep and esoteric topic. God consciousness. What is it? How do we attain it? Is it real? Is it non-duality? Is it possible to achieve for a normal human being? We're going to get all into these topics, and we're going to actually, if you stick around to the end, discover an equation or a formula by which you can realize God consciousness for yourself directly. So stick around. Man, where to even begin? You know, there's so much to talk about in this topic. It is really, really deep, guys. So first, let me just welcome my truth seekers out there. Number one, you guys are the shit. You guys rock. Truth seekers, are you out there? That's what I'm talking. That's who I'm talking to right now. I need to be talking to the truth seekers, not the people who are just interested in being entertained or learning about things. The people who are sincerely invested and really, really want to know the truth. In fact, they want to know the truth so badly that they are willing to sacrifice all of their beliefs. That is the type of intense sincerity and devotion to the truth that is necessary and required to even begin an approach to study this topic. Before we get into any of those, let me just offer a quick disclaimer. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about in this video are very, very deep. You're liable to mistake a lot of what I'm talking about because you have your own impressions of understandings of what these words might mean. You have your own experience. It's all getting filtered through your ego and your beliefs and the culture that you grew up in and your society, and all that kind of stuff is getting filtered through it. And here's the problem. So we need to have a pure, clear understanding if we're to reach the truth. And the problem is when we don't have that clear understanding, it creates distortions. So I can say something to you guys and I can say all the right words and have all the right meaning. But if you have an assumption about what that means that's incorrect, it's going to create distortions in everything that you think from there on out. You'll never be able to arrive at the truth from that pathway. You see, you have to purify your understanding first, and then the knowledge can sink in. The wisdom can actually settle in, and you can have your own understanding that's brought about from within. I mean, that's what education is all about. Educate literally means to draw forth from within. So it's not about stuffing ideas in your head, right? It's not about filling your mind with more beliefs. That's what we need to undo. So I want to also state that, you know, the topics that we're going to be discussing have the potential to really spin someone into a complete mind loop and totally mind fuck them. And I don't want that to happen to somebody. So if you're unstable or if you have any kind of psychological issues that are latent or present, you might not want to watch this video. All right? Save yourself the mental anguish, because we're going to be twisting your mind around a little bit in order to undo it. So now that we've got that stuff out of the way, you know, here's the prerequisites that you got to have for this topic. You have to have an open mind. You have to have a willingness to open your mind to new ideas and be able to take in something that you've never taken in before. Be able to look at things in a different way. Most people, when they go about looking into a topic, they really just want to prove out their own beliefs. They just want to reinforce what they already think, right? It's like confirmation bias. They're just looking for places where what they already believe can be confirmed for them, so they could just makes their belief even stronger. But the problem is, if their belief is wrong in the first place, right? We're never going to get to truth that way. So you have to have an open mind. You have to be willing to stretch, really be willing to let go and drop, even if just for temporarily, your preconceived notions and beliefs about this topic and about everything we're going to be discussing today. That's number one. Number two, as I stated already, a sincere desire for the truth. Having an open mind isn't enough. You can have an open mind all day long. You're just going to let the stuff come in. But if you don't have a sincere desire to know the truth, you're not going to be testing this stuff. And that's what's really required to make this a reality for you, which is what it's all about. I mean, doesn't do any good if I'm just sitting up here talking and entertaining you guys. The whole point of the matter is to give you a direct experience of what God consciousness is for yourself, so that you can know it for yourself and not just take my word for it. So with that out of the way, let us begin. Now, First of all, so what is God consciousness? First, I'm going to have to actually define what it is that we're talking about, because a lot of people have all sorts of different ideas. Many people think it's a mental process. It just means thinking a certain way. As I've already stated, this is not a belief. This is not about adopting a new belief. There's all sorts of new age people out there who are like, oh yeah, everything is one. We're all just one. Love and light, bro. And all that kind of stuff. And, you know, it's fine, right? But it's very surface. And if they're pressed, whenever they confront challenges and whenever their values are really put to the test, a lot of times you see these people's, their whole way of being, right, just kind of crumbles. You can see they react, they resist, they become aggressive or defensive, right? And it just goes to show that they really don't have established this understanding that they claim to have, right? Otherwise, their actions would back it up. But their actions show that they're weak. Their actions show that they don't really have a solid understanding of this. So it's just a belief. And as a belief, it really doesn't do you much good. Sure, it might make you a little bit of a nicer person. It might make you a nicer person. It might make you treat people a little bit better, right? But it doesn't have the power as a belief to radically alter your experience of life, such to the point to where you know this to be so certain and so true that you would lay down your life for it. Can you imagine having something that you know to be so true in yourself that you would happily lay down your life and surrender rather than go against what you know is true? That's the type of realization I'm talking about. The direct experience of knowing that you are God. This is what Jesus talked about, you know, although this is going to be considered blasphemous to a lot of people who are religious types. I know all about religion, trust me. I grew up in the church. I was a freaking altar boy, okay? And no, I didn't get raped by my priest. Why does everyone always ask that? Anyway, so I left all that behind me. You know, I had determined that the ways that they were explaining and teaching about God and religion, it just didn't make any sense to me. It completely seemed, that's what seemed blasphemous to me. How could you imagine a God to be like this? This is insane. And I will never worship a God like this. And that goes not just for Catholicism, but it's pretty much all Christianity across the board, at least as, you know, as we know about it in the public. Sure, there are esoteric forms of Christianity, but they're very, very little known, where they talk about God consciousness, where they talk about God realizations. You know, you may have read about the Gospel of St. Thomas, something like that, where it's a very non-dual text. He talks about this realization, right? And it's even in, you know, there are bits of it in the Bible. Even there's a quote from St. Paul in one of his letters talking about how, may the Spirit which was in Christ Jesus be also within you, that he thought it not robbery to equate himself with the Father. You know, he thought it actually not to be a sin to equate himself with God, right? And he was asking you to actually do the same thing. Ha! He wasn't saying, worship me, I am the greatest. He was saying, God is within you. You are God. I've realized this for myself. I'll lay down my life for this realization because I know it to be true. So God consciousness is the direct realization that you are, in your essential nature, that means your essence, your deepest, innermost being, that you always are, that you always were, and that you always will be, that will never be changed no matter what experience or what circumstance life presents. You are pure awareness, consciousness, appearing as this, appearing as an individual. And so, again, it's not a belief. It's a direct realization of this fact, of this truth. It's an in-seeing. It has to be seen within, directly. So I hope that gives us at least a little bit of a precursor of what it is that we're actually talking about. It's not the belief that I am God, okay? If I have a belief that I'm God, that starts in the mind, and as I'm going to explain very, very clearly as we go along, anything that comes out of that mind-identified state, right, that egoic state, is going to be distorted. So what happens is when an ego believes itself to be God and starts to, get a hold of an idea like God consciousness and starts to try to hold on to it for itself, or tries to, imbue it into itself to make itself grander. I mean, that's what the ego is all about. It's all about making itself greater, right? The thing is, it's actually just a distortion. So it's trying to stretch itself into something that it's not, right? The ego will never be God. And people that think themselves to be individuals and stretching themselves into a belief that they are God, that creates megalomaniac, right? That creates an egomaniac, a complete and total distortion. And we see this all the time with, power hungry, insane, people who are just trying to control everyone, and, they just, they have no concern for anyone else, right? These are people, if you ask them, yes, I am like a god, or I am God, or they might think themselves to be the best, that there could possibly be. But actually, there's just ego. And so that's what it enables them to victimize others and take all sorts of horrible actions against others, because they've missed the point. They've taken themselves to be an ego god, rather than seeing that their very essence is God. See, the realization of seeing how your essence is God is extraordinarily humbling. If humility isn't present, you missed it. There's a couple qualities that we can look for that we can definitely know if someone's on track or not. If there's a sense of deep reverence and humility, we're on to something, okay? Because this realization is not a realization from an ego perspective. It's not the sense of, I am so great. It's the sense of, I am so great. Like, how is this even possible that I am this great, that everything is this great, that I am everything? It's amazing. It's such wonder and humility. And like, I didn't earn this. I didn't deserve it more than someone else. So it's a very humbling experience. There comes with a quality of gratitude also. Again, it's unearned. Now, we have a lot of things that get in the way of this understanding, and I'm going to talk about these obstacles. And for these obstacles, we actually do need to do some work. There is self-effort involved. And this whole path of God realization really comes down to two things. It comes down to the correct balance of self-effort and grace. And I'm going to talk about both these in depth. First of all, let's talk about what the obstacles to this understanding are. It's basically the main thing. We could boil it down to, we call it the ego, right? But what is that? A lot of people talk about ego from different perspectives. We talk about it from a psychological perspective. People might take it to mean different things. So let me just break it down what it is in this understanding. The ego simply means anything, any construct, any functioning of the mind which causes the belief in separation. That's what ego is. Ego function creates the feeling and the sense of an individual, a separate self. Now, that's not a problem in and of itself. We all need egos to function in this world. A healthy ego just knows that, that's their house, this is my house. I don't just walk into their house because they're going to think I'm a little weird. They might get a little uncomfortable if I just walk in their house, even though, in reality, there isn't a their house and a my house. That's just the labels that we've attached to these things so that society can function. Okay? So when you see through the labels, you can function perfectly fine in society without having this ego-identified mind in which you take yourself to actually be the separate person who has the separate beliefs. And all the past history is my history. And you're very attached to these things, right? You actually be willing to lay down your life to protect these things, right? Because you're so invested and attached to them, rather than to lay down your life, let's say, for a principle or for a truth. So the ego is your sense of identity. also. All your identification. I was born this day. I lived in this town I grew up in. I went to this school. These were my friends. I took these classes. I'm a physicist now. I'm a chemist. I'm a trash worker. This is what I am. I'm a musician. All this stuff creates an identity, and we begin to live and filter all of our experiences through that identity. That's ego. And so when we're completely invested in it, we literally take ourselves to be this person. And when we take ourselves to be this person, well, it's going to be impossible to see ourselves in our true nature. It's going to be impossible to realize God consciousness because we're looking through all of our experiences through this filter, and the filter is creating distortions. So we have to remove that filter in order to see the truth and see it clearly. So there's also a lot of other things. There's all of our desires, everything that we want in life. This just creates part of our identity too, right? Everything that we're attached to, everything we're striving for, okay? All of the things that we didn't get that we wanted. This all adds to, our sense of ourself, our frustrations, our passions, our fears. All these things combine to create this structure of self, of an apparent self. And it's maintained by our thinking and this constant stream of thought. And most people, like most of you guys, probably don't have a daily meditation practice. And if you don't, right, how are you supposed to have a break in your stream of thought? You see, that's another big problem, is that in order for you to experience God consciousness, your mind has to be quiet for a period of time. There's just no way that you're going to be able to see through this stream of consciousness, which is so all-consuming. Our thoughts are this mentation, continuous stream of thought that most of us are subject to. We need to start to be able to see through that, or drop it, or let it go, so that we can get a sense of the awareness in which it appears. So when there's so much content on the screen of awareness, it's impossible to actually just see the screen, which is our true nature. Our God consciousness is pure awareness. But when there's just thought after thought after thought after thought, and the chasing and the striving and the wanting and the pushing away and the resisting, all that stuff prevents us from seeing clearly the most obvious truth. And that's the thing about this realization, is it's not a belief that you have to put on top of something in order to see it. It's so funny. It's so radically obvious. And yet, it's so difficult for so many of us to see because of all these things that we've placed on top of it. We're constantly looking away from it. We're constantly looking to find ourselves in things and in circumstances and in thoughts. We have this whole past history of thought. It really crystallizes the person that we believe ourselves to be. This continuous stream of thought, reinforcing all the things that we thought before, reinforcing the character that we take ourselves to be, reinforcing our ego. So there's that. Then there's also people's inherent laziness. This stuff takes work. It takes dedication to truth. It takes being willing to go against the grain of society and what everyone else is saying, what everyone else thinks. Most people don't have that fortitude. So hopefully if you're watching this, you're one of those truth seekers, and you have some fortitude and some discipline, and you're willing to make the self-effort to move past this programming and to let go and dissolve some of this conditioning. You'll actually be able to start to glimpse, see, experience, and know for yourself the truth of your own divine nature. And you don't need to take a drug to do it, although that can help for a lot of people. Psychedelics can be super powerful to open up the windows of this experience. And that's because it floods your mind with such information that it causes the brain to stop and halt and be like, what the fuck is going on? And you start to actually see for the first time. But again, it takes integration. Most of the time, people aren't even willing to do the work that it takes to integrate one of these experiences. So it's just like, oh yeah, that one time when I was, out at the beach and everything was just right and blah, blah, blah. And it all came together and you had that experience, and I felt that, yeah. And so I know what you're talking about, man. I know what God consciousness is. You had a glimpse of it. You had a glimpse of it, right? I'm not going to deny that, but to integrate this, it takes work, it takes practice. Even people who have a tremendous, complete, instantaneous dissolving of the ego. Eckhart Tolle talks about this. It still took him several years to integrate that experience. He was unable to function for a while because it wasn't integrated. And that's another thing that we'll discuss. A lot of people think that you cannot function from a very high state of God consciousness. They just think you'll enter this samadhi type state, a very, very high self-realized state, but you're basically in such bliss and ecstasy, right? And immersion into your own self that you're not able to function in the world. But that's actually not the case. It's often the case in the beginning stages. It's pretty much always the case in the beginning stages. But then over time and with effort, and you keep glimpsing this reality over and over again, what happens is very naturally it begins to shift your identity out of the mind-identified egoic state, and you start to recapitulate a new identity which is based in truth, based in awareness. Your identity as awareness. That's your true identity, because that's what doesn't change. It's what you were before, it's what you are now, it's what you will be, always. That's the good news. This is a very, very high teaching, and there's immense good news. But there's also a lot of what's called in the East tapasya, difficulty. There's a lot of difficulty, and so again, the self-effort, the fortitude, the discipline is all necessary. And if you don't have those, forget it. You'll never be able to carry yourself through these difficult times, this discomfort that you're going to have to go through in order to get to the fruit of this experience, of this realization. I want to give a quick definition of hermeneutical mysticism. I thought this was such an interesting concept when I first came across it. And the more and more I've actually been studying this concept, this truth, it's not a concept, right? Been studying this, though, this topic, if you will, God consciousness, self-realization, God realization, the more I found this to be true. So it's actually a quote by a guy named Jeffrey Kripal, who's an American scholar. And he writes of hermeneutical mysticism, it is a disciplined practice of reading, writing, and interpreting, through which intellectuals actually come to experience the religious dimensions of the texts they study. Dimensions that somehow crystallize or linguistically embody the forms of consciousness of their original authors. In effect, a kind of initiatory transmission sometimes occurs between the subject and object of study. That's so fascinating, and I find it to be exactly accurate in my own experience. The more and more I study this topic, the more I start to realize directly those same realizations of the ancient masters, as well as our modern teachers. So, some of what has to happen with this restructuring of the ego, first it's going to dissolve and break down. You start to see through the concepts of self that are false. You start to see the ways in which you used to see yourself that are obviously not the case. So, for instance, let's see, if you have a sincere desire, right, your life is starting to get filtered through that desire. You start to take yourself to be the one who desires it. And people start to do all sorts of crazy things. They develop these personas, and they go after their goal, right? This is considered normal. However, what happens when you let go of that desire? What happens when that desire dissolves through some practice, right, or some spontaneous means? The desire was there. It was driving you as a person, and then all of a sudden it's gone. Where's that person? Is that person still there? That person's not there anymore. The person who wanted that thing is gone. There's a new person, right? This new experience of personness, which is a freedom from that desire. So now I'm experiencing myself to be more my essential nature. Who am I without that desire? I'm my essential nature. I'm my true self. I'm not the one who needs that thing to be fulfilled and to be satisfied. That's someone who is cut off from themselves. When that desire dissolves or when I let it go, I experience more of my true nature, which is that which is beyond desire. That which is self-fulfilled. So, a lot of work has to be done in the letting go area. Letting go of desires, letting go of aversions, attachments, all of the things that we believe to be true. We need to develop the capacity to let go of. And it takes a certain capacity. People just think, oh, I could let that go. I could just let that go. I could let that go. How about if I just let everything go? Well, you can't. You can't yet. You have to develop the capacity to let things go and to maintain your openness once you've dropped them. It takes a certain inner strength, and it takes practice, and it's a process. You grow and you increase capacity over time. As you surrender and as you let go deeper, your capacity increases, and then your ability to surrender even more increases. So it's like a positive loop. So we've talked about the first thing that needs to happen. We need to have that self-effort, right? We need to be able to start working at the ego, to start recognizing that there is something within us that is distorting our vision, and start to experience directly through practices that as we let go and surrender more and more, as we dissolve our ego more and more, the light of truth begins to shine through on its own. So dissolving the ego is number one prerequisite. It was the number one part of this process, right? All these things are going to be intertwined, though, because the number two thing I'm going to talk about is to have the correct understanding. It's not just enough to undo the understanding that we have that's false. We must also have the correct understanding, the right understanding. Correct understanding also takes work. It takes practice. It takes study, contemplation, inner seeking, right? Self-inquiry. All of these things will start to undo the false understandings that we have, and with more and more study, more and more practice, more and more meditation, contemplation, we have those qualities of open-mindedness, right, and surrender. All of these things are going to help give us the correct understanding that will support this realization. That's another thing too, is like, if you just have a flash of this and you have no reference for it, it will be very difficult to maintain it. So it'll be just like that fleeting kind of memory of this state that you once experienced that was super amazing and blissful, but you can't really quite put your finger on it. And you damn sure can't get back to it. We want to make this a repeatable experience until it becomes a lived experience, an unbroken, lived daily experience. God consciousness, knowing what you are. The third component that is necessary, absolutely, is the guru. A lot of people are not going to like hearing this. A lot of egos are getting very upset right now, thinking, I don't need an ego, I don't need a guru, I don't need God, I don't need anyone. But, well, you're fooling yourself. Because there's simply no way that you yourself as an individual have the power and capacity to raise your understanding to a point to where you could see this. You need grace. Grace is God's power. How are you going to realize God without God's power? It's nonsense. This is the height of egotism. You need grace. You need the guru. But what is the guru? People just think, oh, it's a person, I have to surrender to. I'm going to give over my autonomy to. Fuck that. How do I know this person has the right understanding? You should be very skeptical of these type of ideas. Okay? A true spiritual master, however, certain qualities can be recognized. Number one, they're not seeking followers. They're seeking to liberate others with their teaching. You see? That's the mark of a true master. That's why you can look at the teachings of Christ, for instance, and know that he was a true master, because he was elevating his apostles and the people who were listening to him. He was doing his best to elevate them to his own status, to his own understanding. He wasn't saying, I'm the Son of God and you are my subjects and you should worship me. No, he was saying, I and the Father are one. And you know what? You are too. We're all one. But unfortunately, the history of Christianity, the Bible, all those, everything, all the resources, the scholarly texts, they're pretty pathetic at transmitting this experience or understanding directly. They talk around it. They talk about it in a very misconstrued way. They have terrible misunderstandings. There's no clear non-dual understanding of Christianity or of Christ, for instance, like there is in the East. With Shaivism, with non-dual Shaiva Tantra, with Zen Buddhism, with Tibetan Buddhism. These are all non-dual, or they have their non-dual esoteric branches. And so we have a basis for this understanding that we can refer to, right? But this is all because of the lineage of the masters, the gurus, which have upheld these teachings and have transmitted them to their students by the power of Shaktipat, which is known as the descent of grace. Now, here's the thing. You don't need to have a physical person as a guru in order to attain this understanding. So when I talk about the necessity of a guru, let me be clear. In fact, I'll take this from a course entitled In Search of the Self. The author's name is Ram. And he says, Shaktipat, the descent of grace, is the natural and spontaneous awakening of the inner spiritual energy. For Shaktipat, the guru is necessary. Okay? The guru is the dispeller of darkness. Dispels the darkness, gives the Shaktipat, which is the descent of grace. Okay? The guru is the cosmic force. So see, the guru is not a person. It manifests as a person, oftentimes manifests as a teacher, right? So that people have a lived relationship with a person, right, that can help very greatly in this understanding. However, that is not the true guru. The true guru is a cosmic force. It's the power of God. It is the cosmic force through which the kundalini of the individual, the kundalini is the dormant spiritual energy, which once awakened within the seeker, leads to spiritual realization. So it's the force through which the kundalini of the individual is awakened. It is the awakened kundalini, or Shakti, that burns away all of our samskaras, which are our false impressions, our misunderstandings, all the ego stuff. It gets burned away by the kundalini once awakened. Our false conditioning, our limited and bound ego, it eats away our karmas. Shaktipat is the initiation, the beginning of the process leading to liberation or realization of the self. So, without Shaktipat, you cannot realize the self. Without the Guru's grace, you cannot realize the self. You need the power of God to recognize the power of God. You get it? So if you have resistance to that, it's because of your ego. The ego wants to be in control. The ego doesn't want to surrender. The ego says, fuck that. I'm my own boss. I'll understand God on my own. No, you won't. That's just resistance. And I'm going to explain to you next how that resistance is actually what's keeping you from recognizing your own divinity. And you will never recognize your own divinity so long as you hold on to that resistance. It's simply impossible. And I've discovered a formula which actually proves it pretty clearly. I'll share it with you now. So, resistance, first I'll talk about though. Let me explain what resistance is. Inner resistance is what we're specifically talking about. And it is that within us which rejects things as they are, which doesn't like the way things are, which wants to change things, it wants control. So it manifests as all sorts of things. I give you some of the ways in which resistance manifests. First of all, it divides. It separates. So I don't like those people. I want to live here and not over there. That's resistance, right? That's what divides. It's also what fear is based in. Whenever you're feeling afraid, you're resisting something outside of yourself, something you perceive to be a threat. You resist it. The sense of otherness. Just anytime you see somebody else and you recognize them to be an other, right? And the sense of otherness is built on resistance. They are not you. So there's a sense of subtle resistance, or maybe not so subtle, someone that's irritating you. You definitely feel resistance to that, right? You feel irritated. You feel frustrated. You want them to do something else or to go away. All that is resistance. And what resistance does is it limits capacity. So again, as I was talking before about capacity being necessary to have this realization and to hold it, well, resistance is like exactly what gets in the way of developing that capacity. Our resistance to life, our resistance to ourselves, our resistance to letting go of our beliefs, our resistance, right? We don't want to change our beliefs, our resistance to change in general. We want to believe ourselves to be right. People don't like being wrong. They don't like it when they have their beliefs challenged. They get very defensive. That's resistance. See? Again, this is why the open mind is necessary. Sincere desire for truth is necessary. We have a lot of resistance built up in the system. Immense amounts of resistance. You could not believe how much resistance is in your system that you're probably not even aware of. It's the glue that literally holds everything together that we want to eliminate, that prevents the clear seeing of this reality. So it manifests as a control freak who has to, put all these pieces into place the way that they are, and he's trying his damnedest to keep everything just so, right? And when those things get challenged or shifted or changed, he does not like that. He reacts, all that is resistance. When we deny things about ourselves to ourselves, or when we suppress our feelings, that's all resistance. We don't like this feeling. Well, I don't want to deal with this. I'm just not going to think about it. I don't want to question my beliefs. That's uncomfortable. I'm just not going to think about this. I'm just going to bury my head in the sand. Oh my God. If you've made it this far, I don't think that you are one of those type people. Hopefully not. But you'll start to recognize this more and more. You'll start to see how many people are like this. You challenge their beliefs, their heads go right in the sand. They put the blinders up and on. Resistance. Nothing gets in. No. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to know this. It's childlike, right? It's childish, not childlike. Immature. It's the mark of limited capacity. It's the mark of weakness. Openness is strength. Ability to admit one's wrong is strength. And it takes great strength and great capacity to maintain this awareness. Again, this is where we need the Guru's grace and the power of God. The more and more we're able to discover the power of God and surrender to that power of God, the more and more it will begin to uplift us. It starts to do the work. It's actually doing the work anyway. I just want to take a moment to mention that if you're enjoying this talk, if you enjoy this topic and this content, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Go ahead and like this video right now. Yeah, go ahead right down there. Click that little button. Yes. All right. So, yes, where were we? Resistance. Resistance is like the energy of suppression, suppressing the energy of God from arising into our conscious awareness, where it could reunite with our own apparently individual awareness. This is the reunification of Shiva and Shakti. Shakti is the divine energy of God. Shiva is the consciousness of God. And when these two are reunited, we have what's known as spiritual realization. So how is this all based in resistance? Well, it became clear to me as I began to investigate the relationship between resistance and capacity. I started looking at this in electronics. I started looking at this in mental world, I started looking at this, for instance, when we look at old incandescent light bulbs versus the way that LED lights function, LED lights are incredibly more efficient. They use way less energy and they produce much more light. And why is that? Well, it's because the way they're designed is they use their energy much more efficiently. They don't create the resistance that old incandescent bulbs. They don't really work on that resistance. They're light-emitting diodes, so the energy goes through them. This is just a very rudimentary understanding, okay? The light goes through them, and as the energy passes, or the energy goes through, and as it passes, it lights up that cell and continues on to the next one, lighting on that one. And there's no resistance because the energy is going through from one to the next. That's why they don't create all the heat also that regular light bulbs and incandescent bulbs, high pressure sodium, metal halides, and all these things, they create massive amounts of heat. Well, it's because of resistance. It's the resistance that causes the heat. It's the resistance that limits the capacity. So it requires much more energy to produce the same amount of light. It's that resistance which is limiting the expression of that energy. You see, without the resistance, we would have the pure expression of that energy. And as with the LED lights, there's less resistance, so we have more expression for less effort. It's the same way in our mental life. When we resist things in our minds all the time, it makes us stressed out. It causes the body to get stressed and contracted. We start holding all this tension. And that tension that we're holding in our body literally is choking our life force. It's like creating kinks in all of these internal meridians and energy lines. That information and energy is always traveling through, but as we have this stress and tension in our lives from our minds, from our thoughts, it creates resistance, limiting our capacity. You see? This is why the body starts to become unhealthy, why people get sick. They don't have a free flow of energy. Their capacity has been diminished, and it's all because of resistance. It's directly related, and we can prove this for ourselves. And this is the thing, guys. You need to start checking this stuff for yourself. I'm going to give you some practices that you can do, but the main principle is notice when you let go of resistance, you will instantly become aware of an increase in your capacity. It's a sense of fullness, sense of fulfillment that starts to arise from within. So as we surrender resistance, right, as we're able to dissolve resistance, we let go of our mentations, we let go of our ego, we let go of our thinking, and we are able to experience more directly without that filter of the mind, right? Able to drop that resistance, and now we're able to experience the direct free flow of energy. And our capacity naturally increases. And remember, capacity is what we need to have abundance of if we are to understand and realize directly for ourselves God consciousness. This is not theoretical. That's one of the things I really can't stress enough. None of this stuff is a theory. This is all I'm speaking directly from my own experience. From the practices, the study, the discipline, all of the undoing that's been going on for the last almost 20 years now. I've been able to notice and watch and see within myself this increasing of capacity and this direct realization increasing. And it's exponential too. It's so difficult at first to see this. It's really hard to see any of this stuff at first. There's so much resistance. There's so much tension. There's so much filter. There's so much ego. It's nearly impossible. That's, again, why you need the grace of the guru. And for those of you who are watching now, the grace of my gurus are coming through these words. They're coming through right now so they can affect you directly. So don't think that you are separate from this grace. You're never separate from the grace of God. It's only a matter of tuning into it and opening to it. But if we're not even aware of it, if we don't appreciate it, it's not going to be able to work very effectively for us. It's something that needs to be entreated. Something that needs to be seeked after with sincerity, desire. If it were easy, everyone would know it, right? If it were that easy, everyone would be awake and God realized. But they're not. Why? because it's difficult, even though it's extraordinarily simple and obvious. But let me show you how you can start to eliminate this false understanding and start to recognize a simple formula that will ultimately lead to your own God realization. In fact, it can't do anything but that. Once you get this, guys, this is a game changer. All right, so this visual aid might be helpful. Also, I wanted to keep in mind that this video is really just an overview of this whole topic. I mean, this topic is so vast and deep. It would be impossible to cover every single nuanced detail of exactly what one is going to go through, the whole process of dissolving the ego, the inner workings of the self, and the spontaneous awakening of Kundalini, and all the factors that are involved there. I mean, it's a vast, vast topic. As I said, it goes on forever. So just keep that in mind, and as we go through, if you're interested in working at some of these processes a bit deeper, be sure to reach out and send me an email, and we can check to see if we would be a good fit to work together. So, well, with that said, I'm going to go back to this equation first. Remember, on this side we have energy, the E. This is the inexhaustible source of God. Now, this equation is going to hold true really regardless of whatever system we're looking in. So it's really a very powerful understanding to have in life in general. But for this in particular, I find it to be indispensable. So we have energy minus resistance equals capacity. And your capacity is just your life expressed at any given moment. It's you at your fullest in this moment is your capacity. But tomorrow, your capacity might increase or it might decrease. And then if you're expressing at that level, it will have a significant effect on your output and capability. So what we can understand, right, this is your life expressed, right? This is you for all intents and purposes. And this is God. This is God consciousness, God realization as it is. So the inexhaustible, infinite source of God on the one hand is energy. And as it gets expressed as your life, that shows us what your capacity is. The limiting factor, however, is resistance. This resistance right here is all of the misperceptions, all of the misidentifications, everything concerning your ego, your belief systems, all that separation, all that resistance is what's limiting your capacity and your expression of God in the fullest, and also your direct realization of God. You see, as we begin to work at this resistance with various processes, and as the guru and the guru principle and the Kundalini, as it's awakened, the Shakti begins to go to work on all this inner resistance, and it begins to dissolve it. Over time, these samskaras, these impressions, and all of this ineffective way of functioning begins to undo itself. Through this process, it's very, very incredible and fascinating that we're talking about here, this awakening to God realization. So the more and more we let go of our fears, for instance, we let go of our, desires. And that doesn't mean that we have to give up on life. Again, these topics are so nuanced. People think, oh, if I just let go of my desires, then what am I going to do? But what's going to drive me at that point? But what you'll start to realize is there's an inner fulfillment that starts to arise as we come into contact with our own God essence. And that inner fulfillment starts to propel us. It starts to propel our lives forward so that now we're no longer being driven by desires. We're actually being driven and propelled by this inner force, which is pushing us towards deeper and deeper expression of consciousness. Hello. Okay. No worries, man. I'll see you soon. All right, thanks. You never know what's going to happen. I thought this was supposed to be on silence. What the heck? Yeah. Silence this. So strange. All right, well, apparently it was important. All right, where the heck were we? It's always something. Oh boy. All right. Thank you, God. All right. Ah, it's so good. It's so good. All right. All right. Thank you, Lord. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. Whew. All right. Spontaneous awesomeness. All right. Where were we? So, okay, let's see. As we eliminate these fears and desires, right, through these processes, we can't get rid of them through more and more struggle and effort, because that's, as I said, just more resistance. You're just compounding the resistance that's already there when we try to work at it that way. So bear with me now. I'll get into some of these processes more deeply on other videos. And as I said, again, you can reach out to me for some one-on-one training if that suits your fancy. But why would anyone want to have joy or bliss? I don't know. That's when you could have problems and struggles. I don't know. Anyways, all right. So what happens is you start to let go of these fears, desires, wrong understandings, all of these impressions and filters which prevent us from seeing the reality of that, the truth, which is already present, which always is, the reality that you are already that which you are seeking. Now, don't get it twisted. A lot of people think, oh, well, I'm already that which I'm seeking, so I don't really have to do anything. No, that's incorrect. Your understanding is completely twisted around. You must have self-effort and discipline. Otherwise, you could just be wasting precious time, just floundering and expecting the guru or God to do everything for you. That's not the way that it works. Again, this is only for sincere seekers. If you don't sincerely seek and have an open mind, you don't get the fruit of this understanding. That's just it. It doesn't matter what you believe about me or, what you end up experiencing from your own egoistic perspective in your life. It doesn't matter if you gain $1 million or all the riches in the world or whatever, it is that you're desiring. It's all going to amount to suffering in the end if you don't have this. And this understanding is the awakening of pure joy. A joy that is not dependent on circumstances, people, situations. So one is free, because that's the quality of awareness. Your essential nature is awareness, and the quality of awareness is freedom, independence. It's the source of all, so how could it be dependent on anything? All right, so you understanding this part right here, I want to go a little bit deeper into this resistance and watch how the whole identity is created and built upon it. Okay? So what we have is resistance yields separation. Without resistance, we cannot have separation. Separation is built on resistance. So this very act of taking oneself to be an individual is resistance at its core. You have to limit your capacity tremendously in order to identify as a limited individual. Of course, you don't realize that you're doing that. It's just automatic at this point because you've been conditioned to do so. But a lot of people are working on, let's say, the level of suffering to try to heal themselves. But suffering is built upon this whole idea of separation. You can't have suffering without an individual. It's not possible. You might have pain, right? There might be discomfort. If someone's beating the body or, torturing it, it's going to experience pain. But that's not suffering. Suffering is mental anguish, emotional anguish, spiritual anguish. It's not having to do with, it has to do with a story of suffering. It has to do with a story. This is my suffering, right? It has to be about somebody. Otherwise, it's just experience. It might not be pleasant, but it's not suffering. For suffering to happen, there has to be a story attached to it that gives it meaning. That's what makes it suffering. So for a story to be attached, well, the story is built on separation. It's built on the idea of a person who's separate, a separate person who suffers. And that separate person who's suffering is being held in place by the energy of resistance. So a lot of people are trying to alleviate their suffering out here, but it's never really going to take them all the way because they're going to be continuously creating more suffering by the very fact that they take themselves to be a limited being. This is how karma actually gets created. So what's happening is this is the way that most people are going. This is the trajectory that most society and almost everybody in the world is going. And the process that we're talking about to God realization, to awakening to that, is going this way. You're actually reversing the polarity of the direction in which you're looking. Again, so most people are identified with the world and with the mind and all that is looking outwards, right? So when we reverse the process and begin to look inwards, this is eventually what starts to happen. And you got to get through a lot of resistance to actually awaken to this. But you can see how if you're just letting go of suffering, you're never going to let go of the self, like the person that you take yourself to be that suffers. You could just be letting go of suffering forever. It might help you feel better, but you're not going to awaken to God consciousness. But when you start to let go of the resistance on which the separate identity is built, you see, then what happens is the whole structure of separate identity begins to crumble. Now, this can be a crisis for some people. So again, let me remind you that it's very important to go all the way with this. If you start to go half-hearted into this, you could find yourself stuck. And if you find yourself stuck, don't hesitate to reach out because it is very tricky waters, right? Keep in mind, and at the end of this video, I'm sure if I haven't already mentioned it, we're going to talk about some of the qualities that awakened awareness has in its recognition of God consciousness. Those qualities are truth and awareness of truth, the consciousness itself, and bliss. So it's a joy that is beyond explanation, comprehension, measure, and it's an inner quality that you can sense directly, that you'll know when you experience. It's unmistakable. So if that isn't present, you're not there yet all the way. So definitely a key component is missing. So if you're ever feeling disheartened, know that you have to go deeper. If you're feeling depressed, saddened, grief, if you're feeling panicked about this understanding, if you feel alone, you have to go deeper, okay? A lot of people get scared when they start to feel alone. They start to collapse in on themselves, and it's terrifying to them. But you have to take heart. This is why we rely often on the strength of those who have gone before us, because they can help us to navigate these waters when it gets difficult. All right, but take heart. You can get there. You're not going to get there in one video, okay? Just keep that in mind. This is just designed to really crack some of the, structure loose a little bit, so start to let some of the light come through. All right. So, in any case, you can see the I is here, and when we get to letting go of resistance, the I is already dissolved. When we're letting go of resistance at its core, the I has already dissolved, and we get to experience what is beyond resistance, which is our source, infinite God consciousness, our own self. So on the one hand, we have energy. I'm just going to do this as best I can, explaining this. It's a tricky thing to get into, okay? But just stay with me. We have an infinite source of energy on the one hand. And we can look at any system that we want to. But right now, we're just going to look at the total system. The infinite energy of God, source, consciousness. Now, on the one hand, that's everything that is. And on the other hand, we have our lives expressed, which is our capacity. So we have the energy on one hand and the capacity on the other. The energy of God, which is infinite, inexhaustible, eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, all of that and more, indescribable. It's all that. It's everything. And then we have our limited capacity. And why are we so limited? We take ourselves to be an individual. We misperceive the reality of who we are. We believe ourselves to be these limited selves, and so we experience ourselves as being limited. We struggle in life. We resist. We encounter strife, hardship, most of it self-created. Through our inability to recognize this truth and to live it. So we have the energy of God, the source, all infinite, all encompassing on one side, and we have our capacity on the other. What is separating the two? What is limiting our capacity, our expression? It's nothing but resistance. Our resistance is exactly what limits our capacity, just as in the electrical system I was talking about before. Just as in the mental system when I'm holding on to all these desires, right? When those desires are gone, the freedom opens up, right? When that resistance dissolves, the full expression of the capacity comes to fruition. So, as I was looking at this, when I first discovered this formula, it was just like I realized the power of it as an individual. To increase my own power, to increase my own effectiveness and capability and ability. I was like, well, if I want to become a better guitar player, I've got resistance built up in my muscles. That's what's really limiting me. It's limiting me from being able to go from trotting really fast, as hard, as fast as I can on the guitar, to being able to gallop and just free, gallop, fluid. Does that make sense? It's like a whole different paradigm shift when you can make that jump. When you realize that the resistance is what's been holding you back. It's like, imagine you're trying to do a long jump, but you're carrying 50 extra pounds in a backpack. Well, when you take that backpack off, you're suddenly able to jump way farther. Your capacity's increased tremendously. Why? Because you're not carrying all that resistance around with you, that dead weight. That was just resistance. You freed yourself of that. You sloughed it off, and now, capacity increases. You feel lighter. You feel freer. You feel tremendous. You feel like you could fly, right? That's capacity increase, directly as a result of letting go of resistance. Well, it's the same thing in consciousness. Our resistance to life, our beliefs, all these are based in resistance. All of our fears, all of our desires, all of our aversions, our whole history, basically the very essence of who we take ourselves to be, a separate individual, all of it has its basis in resistance. So as we surrender that resistance more and more, the fullness of God's power comes through our lives and is expressed as our capacity. And as that resistance dissolves more and more, and the energy flows through more and more, a very natural and spontaneous awakening begins to happen, begins to transpire all on its own. We begin to recognize our true self. We see it. We start to recognize within us the power of awareness. Awareness is God's power. There isn't another power. All power comes from awareness. And again, this isn't theory. This is look inside. Dissolve all the crap. Let go of all your resistance and look inside. You will see this. The power of God is awareness. And it's what you are. You've just been misperceiving it. Or missing it altogether. You've been looking out instead of looking in. And when you look in, it can be painful. It can be difficult. People look in for a little while and then they encounter things that they don't like. So they stop. They get so far and then it becomes too painful. So they quit. This spiritual realization stuff is too scary. It's too uncomfortable. I'll just stick with my beliefs. Everyone else is fine with their beliefs. Why do I need to go against the grain? Well, you don't. But if you're a sincere truth seeker, you will. This will drive you mad to not understand this. Right? But don't let it. Because here's another thing. I want to inspire some of you guys. Because I've had some people contact me with some very, very deep existential crises which have come about as a result of examining some of these topics. They haven't been able to figure them out for themselves, and it's created anxiety and stress and a mental breakdown. And that's not what we're aiming for here. Could be a necessary part of your process, but we want to minimize it as much as possible because you're not going to be in a very high state to be able to affect anything positive. So let me give you a couple of things to look for. This is about recognition. There's a reason why in Sanskrit this realization is called Sat Chit Ananda. Sat, truth. Remember that? The prerequisite. Truth with a capital T. Truth is what is. Reality. Before my perspective distorts it, before I start thinking about it. It's just everything as it is. Prior to your thoughts about it. That's reality. The thoughts come in and say, oh, it's this way or that way. But that's not reality. That's your perspective. That's your opinion, right? That's your thoughts about reality. Reality is, in its essence, already as it is. It doesn't need your commentary. Truth and reality are the same thing. Sat. Chit is being, consciousness. So we have truth and we have being conscious. We have the reality of what is, and we have the consciousness of that reality. Prior to thought, just the pure awareness. Okay? Truth, consciousness. And the third component, ananda, is bliss. So if there isn't a joy arising along with this realization, that's a critical component that is missing. And this is the problem when people start getting their heads spun around and start to going, down the spiral of mental degradation and end up in psych wards because they haven't been able to get to the bottom of this realization and make sense of it. And they feel so alone in the world. Well, if there's no separation, that means there's only me and everything else is not real. And, they just break down. But if they had the inner joy, if they had tapped into the Ananda, it would take care of all of that. You see? This is a beautiful experience of wonder, joy, depth, immensity, and it never ends. It's ever fresh. It doesn't get old. It's like fresher now than it was moments ago. And then it was as fresh as can be. And it will be even more fresh. So those three components are absolutely necessary. And if one of them is missing, you're off track. So if you have a sense of depression or a sense of heaviness about this, you're missing the Ananda component, and that's okay. That just means that more work needs to be done. It just means that you have to go through some more tapasya, more difficulty, more surrender. And now let me get to that point, because that is really where the rubber meets the road in this understanding. We have resistance as the key component which is preventing this realization, right? Our resistance limits our capacity. We need greatest capacity in order to recognize this truth and to hold it in the face of all the other stuff that's going against it, apparently, right? All the apparent individualization, all of the difficulties, all the problems, all the stuff that makes us worry, all the stuff that takes us into our heads, that makes us ego identified, that entrenches us into that state. As we let go of that, as the resistance dissolves and our capacity naturally increases, we are now able to hold this state. And it's not that we are holding it. It just takes, at this point, a very, very gentle, subtle effort to maintain it. Just enough to keep the awareness on itself. That's what starts to happen is, as the resistance dissolves, awareness begins to recognize itself within. One begins to recognize its source in awareness. I know it's very subtle and tricky, but it's as if we have this local awareness that's normally attached behind our eyes in this ego-identified, mind-identified state, and this is the main filter we're seeing and experiencing through. But through these practices and processes and through the awakening of the Kundalini and the spiritual energy, it begins to go to work on this. And we begin to be able to detach our identity from this mind-oriented state. And as we detach it, we start to realize it's freedom. We are not this person we took ourselves to be, but there's a deeper center within us. It's known in Buddhism as heart-mind. It's what Locke Kelly calls heart-centered awareness, awake awareness. And this is a transition that begins to happen. As we let go of the mind-identified state, we begin to naturally recapitulate ourselves in our true center. We still have access to the mind. We still have the ability to use the mind, but the mind is no longer running the show, convincing us that we're a separate individual that needs to strive, fight, resist, claw its way to the top, protect itself. We begin to see through all of that. It just drops away. We start to see and experience directly with awareness instead of through the filter of mentation. We start to be able to know things directly instead of through the filter of thought, where we just know about things, Someone could give you an entire discourse on honey and how it's created, how it's manufactured, all the different qualities and characteristics, all the different grades, and they've never tasted it. So what do they actually know of honey? Nothing. They know nothing of honey. They just know about honey. And this is the way most people are with religion, spirituality, and with God. They could tell you all sorts of things about God. Every religious person can tell you about God, can tell you what he is, his personality traits, her characteristics, what she likes, what she hates, who's going to hell, who's going to heaven. And you don't know shit. You know nothing of God. You know about God. You've never experienced the direct realization of God, these religious types. And yet they're the ones who are trying to tell everyone what to think and what to believe and how to act. It's preposterous. So, as you begin to awaken to this reality, certain things will start to appear. Revelations, which you can pretty much count on, these realizations occurring in some form or another, if you've really tapped into it. One of the things that you realize is that this realization goes on forever. There's no end to it. The depths that you can realize this are continuous, ongoing, and eternal. So these principles will be the same. Every teacher who is awakened to this reality will be talking basically about the same things. But the depth of their experience of them could be vastly different. Because the longer we are on this path, the deeper it gets. The deeper our understanding gets, the deeper our experience gets. You'll start to see that awareness cannot be divided. In fact, awareness has never been divided. It's not divided amongst people. It's not divided between God and I. There is no division in awareness. When you look directly, you begin to see it's boundless, infinite, eternal. It's the source, and you are not separate from it. It is within you. And it's what you are. And you'll also, this is a transcendent level right here. When you really start to get this and start to let go of the resistance, and the resistance just naturally starts to drop away, when this process really begins to take hold. I mean, this awareness is so critical because as you begin to see how resistance is limiting you, that's so empowering. You will begin to look for places where you can let go of resistance. You'll begin to encounter resistance directly all the time, and you'll start to realize, oh shit, this is fucking me up. This is not helping. You'll start to, go about your old patterns of trying to get what you want aggressively, or, with some sort of defense mechanism, trying to control people and manipulate others. And you'll start to realize all this is resistance. And it's limiting my capacity. And you'll begin to let it go spontaneously. You'll just see through it. It just makes no sense. It's like, would you hold on to a hot poker that was burning the shit out of you? No, you just let it go because you see it's burning you. You know it's no good to hold on. Even if it's attached to a pot of gold, it doesn't matter. That's not doing you any good to hold on to it like this. So you drop it. It's the same way with resistance. You realize that holding on to resistance in any form is only limiting your capacity. You're shooting yourself in the foot. In all aspects of life, in your emotional life. When we resist the emotions that we feel, or we resist the circumstances which cause us to feel these emotions. So now we start to avoid situations and people and things, right? That's all limitation. That's not increased capacity. That's all limitation. It comes from resistance. You see? If you want to be free, freedom comes from surrendering, resistance. And that is the final teaching that I want to talk about. We have to understand how to undo this resistance. It's not just going to go away on its own. It goes away through the power of surrender. It's the antithesis of resistance. Resistance is fighting, struggling against, going against. Surrender is going with. A lot of people think surrender is weak. I cannot stress this enough. There is true surrender. And true surrender is empowerment, always. When I say surrender, I'm not talking about giving up. That's the difference. Giving up is resistance. Don't you see? Giving up is just a form of resistance. It's just resisting your true self. It's resisting your spirit. You're resisting the flow. You're resisting the energy of God. That's why you give up. You resist the frustration. You can't take it anymore, so I quit. That's not surrender. So as you're watching this, of course, it's going to come to mind at some point, how do I get rid of resistance? I want to become God. I want to realize my God nature. And resistance is the main thing that's keeping me from seeing that, from realizing it directly. So how do I get rid of resistance? Well, that's tricky because the problem is when you're trying to get rid of resistance, that's actually just more resistance. You're just adding resistance to the whole equation. Trying to control, trying to get rid of, trying to manipulate, that's all resistance. That's why we need the spiritual power of God to dissolve this for us. And the only way we access that is through surrender. This inner surrender that instantly empowers us. Surrender is power. And when you discover this, your life will change radically. You'll be able to let go at a depth that you never even imagined. And you will increase your capacity far beyond what you ever imagined. And it will continue and continue infinitely. Because that is the process. You see, when energy is limited by resistance and expresses as limited capacity, we have what we call the individual self. When that resistance, through spiritual practice, awakening, grace, the combination of grace and self-effort, dissolves that resistance, eventually that resistance dissolves until it is no more. And once it's no more, the source energy of God equals the capacity of your life expressed. There's no more resistance getting in the way to limit it. So now the full expression of God's power comes through. There's no longer anyone there to inhibit it. There's no longer a me getting in the way. There's simply the uninhibited flow, the uninterrupted flow of God consciousness, awareness energy, spontaneously manifesting as this moment and everything. It truly is the highest attainment, the most beautiful, wonderful, mysterious, deep, esoteric, and magical, miraculous awakening that could possibly be. And yet it is real, and it is you. It's your own true nature. It's what I am, and it's what you are, and it's what we are eternally. So I really enjoyed this transmission, and I've been really anxious and eager and excited to talk about this and to engage this conversation more and more. So, I'm sure this is going to bring up tons of questions, lots of, wheels are going to start turning. So please put a comment below if you have a question, reach out to me, or you can email me. My email is in the description. The way you can contact me if you'd like. Let's continue this conversation if you're having some kind of difficulty with any of this stuff. If you're at a sticking point you just can't get past. A lot of times it just takes one little in-seeing to recognize where you're stuck. And then the whole thing can start to come unraveling. Like, I get it. Yes. So that's my hope. That's my aim. That is my mission. To better and better express this truth so that it also may affect all of the other parts of myself that are sleeping or in various states of unrest, and bring about a state of recognition, recapitulation, wholeness, wonder, love. You know, someone asked me as I was explaining this to them, they said, wait a minute, so what about love? And I said, oh, well, love, that's easy. Love is just the natural expression of consciousness when it's uninhibited by resistance. Love is the most natural thing in the world. Love is all there is, you know? It's just that resistance prevents us from seeing and experiencing it. And not just that, but also from expressing it consciously. So I hope, sincerely, I trust that this was helpful, that you have had some realizations, some insights as a result of this, and that it's sparking some questions within you, causing you to think deeper, to reverse some of these processes that have been shrinking your awareness and shrinking your capacity, and to start to dissolve some of that resistance that's going on. And just keep in mind, the more that you let go of resistance, the more your capacity increases. It's instantaneous. And anytime you are heightened in your awareness and are present, you will pick up on this. You'll notice it inside. You can't miss it. You just have to pay attention. You got to be paying attention to how you're feeling and to what's going on in your awareness, in your consciousness, and you'll start to see directly, oh man, I let go of some resistance there. And then you'll feel this instant billowing up of inner fulfillment, of inner energy. That's consciousness. That's awareness. It's God's power arising within you, transforming you. So take heart, keep the practices, keep searching, keep seeking truth, keep believing in your ability to recognize it, in your capacity to understand it, and your capability of living it and expressing it, the true essential nature of yourself, God. From one God to another, from one expression of God to another. Thanks so much for joining. And I've got another video coming right up, so stick around. You're not going to want to miss this one. I love you guys. It's been a pleasure. I'll see you on the next one.